the CEO of the Australian Christian Lobby. Please welcome to the stage, Michelle Pearse.
Good morning, everybody. It is such a pleasure to be here at CPAC and to speak with you all. Well, it's quite providential, actually, that I'm speaking on a Sunday morning, because usually on a Sunday morning I'm in church. So I thought this would be my good opportunity to preach. So welcome to the CPAC church service. I won't go that far. Well, I've been in this job as the CEO of the Australian Christian Lobby for only 12 weeks now, after living abroad in London for 5 years. And what's taken me by surprise when I went to London was the attachment that I felt to my homeland when I lived abroad. The bushland, the beach, the weather, the sport, the wildlife. And I longed for my home, for Australia, when I lived in London. And I landed in Sydney a few months ago. It was my first time back to Australia in 5 years. And I took the train from the airport to Circular Quay. And when I got off the train, being hit by the sun, the sound of the seagulls, the smells, and there was an Aboriginal man playing the didgeridoo, and it was like water to my soul. To say that the sense of being home was comforting really is an understatement. I felt this deep sense of belonging. It's like a warm blanket. And even though it was great to be back home, there's this thing called reverse culture shock. And it identifies a sense of shock when somebody returns home after living abroad. And for me, coming to work at the Australian Christian Lobby was certainly a baptism of fire after being away from this country for 5 years. The day I arrived and I began my job, the first week, the state directors for the Australian Christian Lobbies, we have state directors in every state, they flew in to tell me the story of what had happened in their states for the past 5 years. And with every presentation, my heart felt heavier. And they decided to save the worst for last, Victoria. The Australia that I left 5 years ago is very different to the Australia that I returned home to, and it's very sad. Because Australia is a beautiful, free, democratic, multicultural country, and to see the attacks on our freedom and the rise of injustice is truly heartbreaking. So I've come with an interesting perspective, because I'm not a frog in the water who died to the realities of our culture whilst being left in it. I jumped abroad to another nation and then jumped back in, only to look around and see a very different nation to the one I left. And like a voice crying in the wilderness, the Australian Christian Lobby and many others had forewarned the consequences of the laws that were being passed and the ideologies that were being taught in school 5 years ago. And now we are living in those consequences. And who are the losers? Children. The motive of our lobbying is because we care about children and about the future of this beautiful nation. You know, as Christians, the attacks on our freedoms are nothing new. The attacks are as old as Christendom themselves. And when you consider the Jewish people as a nation under God, they were also under attack. The Old Testament recounts stories of the Jews enslaved in Egypt, Daniel being ordered to worship a gold statue in Babylon, King Xerxes threatening genocide of the Jewish people. And then in the New Testament, we see the persecution of the apostles, even unto death. But time and time again, God raised up a deliverer and turned an evil situation into victory. And this gives me and all of us at the Australian Christian Lobby and Christians around the nation hope and courage that our fight is not in vain. Moses lobbied Pharaoh, and after great hardship, Pharaoh let the people go. Daniel held to his convictions and refused to worship the golden statue, and after being thrown into the lion's den, God shut the mouths of the lions, and we're praying the same would happen for people like Moira. And he found favour in the eyes of the king. And Esther, a woman of great courage, made the case of the Jews to King Xerxes, and the evil decree against her people was reversed. And in the New Testament, even though Paul was held in chains and the apostles were beaten and stoned and even put to death, the gospel continued to spread. The attack on Christians is nothing new, and my message today at CPAC is that truth cannot be silenced because life itself testifies to the truth. Our chromosomes, the heartbeat of a child within the womb, and even our common mortality, death being the great equalizer, testifies to the truth that we are all equal and we are all subject to the same conditions. King David tells us in Psalms that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, knitted together in our mother's womb. The truth? A living being within the womb is a biological reality, and every one of us here were as such. If we were not living within the womb, then what were we? And as we read in Genesis, God created male and he created female. And we see the evidence of this biological reality in our reproductive organs. And so, the truth that we desire to make public is fundamental to who we are as human beings. And no matter how hard they try to silence us, the truth will testify unto itself. And the more that our nation wars against the truth, the greater its internal conflict will be. And who is harmed in the war against truth? Children. Little girls who are encouraged in their immaturity and vulnerability to identify as a boy, and little boys encouraged and affirmed in their vulnerability to be a girl. And when there is no challenge to this idea, when children are lied to, the tragic end result is castration, a mental castration first of all, which is them rejecting, despising their own bodies, despising their biological identity, despising themselves, leads to a physical castration. And children are being groomed from the early years to reject themselves, to reject their biology, and by the time they are teens, a natural thing for them to do, in their eyes, is to block their natural pubescent development and castrate themselves. What happened to the tomboy girl? What happened to the gentle boy? We should celebrate the uniqueness and differences in our girls, that some are rough, some would rather play football than play with dolls, and I was one of those girls, and that's great. We should celebrate the differences in boys, that some are gentle, and some would rather play dress-ups and make-believe than play soccer, and that is okay, that's great. Why should our differences now lead to radical surgery? And why are the voices of dissent silenced? Why is any opposition criminal? Is it because the truth has power? Is it because the truth is confrontational and uncomfortable? Is it because we want to redefine life and redefine gender and redefine science in our own way? Is it because we are proud? Because we reject any higher power or scientific reality for that matter that tells us otherwise? So much for the Enlightenment, that in the minds of the intellects was supposed to move us beyond religion to reason. What has that accomplished? As I heard on a John Anderson Conversations podcast, one of his guests said, the age of reason has become the age of unreason. Perhaps the undoing of truth started all the way back in 1969 when it became legal to kill a child in the womb. Now, I know there's differing views of this in the room, but if I could ask you for one moment just to step outside of your cultural paradigm, this era of modernity, make yourself naive to the concept of abortion and ask yourself the question, basic question, is the child within a womb life? And if this child within the womb is life, should we allow the destruction of life? And I'm not talking about these situations where the mother's life is at risk, or I'm talking about the over 95% of the 80,000 abortions that happen in Australia every year for psychosocial reasons. We've got to connect the dots as to what is happening in our culture. You see, the undermining of morality at a seemingly small level justifies it at an even greater level. You see, many are okay with abortion pre-12 weeks. However, now many states allow abortion to birth, and even babies who survive abortions, that happens, are not protected but are left to die with no medical care. Baby Jessica Jane was born alive in the Northern Territory after a failed abortion. She screamed for 80 minutes. Her AGPA scores were good. She could have survived, but she was left to die, and she was provided no justice after her death. There was no advocate, no criminal proceedings to this day. During the past 10 years, the only two states which record an occurrence of babies surviving abortions and then being left to die is Victoria and Queensland, and they've recorded 700 babies have faced a similar fate. Some only take a few breaths, some live for minutes, but others live for hours with no medical intervention and left to die. What a great tragedy, what a great injustice to these most vulnerable lives. Let's look at the traditional family. We redefined marriage by removing the male-female requirement, and now gender is undermined and teens are taking puberty blockers and preparing for castration. We say prostitution is okay, let's legalise prostitution. Men should be free to buy sex and women should be free to sell their bodies. And now wherever prostitution is legal, human sex trafficking increases. We allow the proliferation of pornography, easy access for children, one click away for them to see harmful material. And we wonder why there's an increase in child-on-child sexual abuse. Undermining truth on the seemingly minor issues leads to great injustice and ultimately societal breakdown. Christians have often been the ones to push back, who speak up, not because we want to show everybody that we're right, but because we care, particularly for the vulnerable. And our compassion is a more powerful force than our fear of persecution. And so we will continue to be persecuted as it goes, but we will also continue to speak. Throughout the centuries, Christians have used their voice to speak against injustice and have acted for the good of mankind, motivated by compassion. And that compassion comes from Jesus Christ, who said to his disciples, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for the least of these brothers or sisters of mine, you did for me." Christian compassion was responsible for the outlawing of the burning alive of widows in India in 1829, outlawing the painful and crippling practice of binding the feet of young women in China in 1912, the establishment of hospitals. The First Ecumenical Council of the Christian Church in Nicaea in 325 AD directed that every bishop should establish a hospital in every city where there was a cathedral. The biblical principle of equality was the pillar of the campaign to abolish the slave trade in Britain through the heroic work of William Wilberforce in the 19th century. It was Christians who began schooling poor children using Sunday school, as this was the only day that poor children were not working in the factories, and the children would be taught how to read, and their textbook was the Bible. The first schools, the first hospitals, were movements led by Christians. And I'm not ignoring our stains of the past, of which I know there are some. But what often happens is these stains, they hog the attention, and the good of which there is so much is often ignored. You know, I can quite confidently say that Christians have had a positive influence on society. Why? Because of our compassion and belief in equality. As Senator Antic explained yesterday, there is an attack on our freedom to be able to speak the truth on online platforms for fear of it being labelled as misinformation or disinformation. And this limits our ability to be compassionate on our online platforms. And I'm not being extreme in saying that the ACMA code, it's the Australian Communications and Media Authority, that their code will extend to posts online against abortion, because this would be considered harmful against women, or sharing a Christian view on gender and sexuality, as it may be harmful to the LGBTQ plus community, or even the gospel, as it may be harmful to other religions or atheists. Currently, the New South Wales government is proposing gay conversion therapy laws, even worse than the Victorian gay conversion therapy laws. And the law extends to efforts to a Christian who wants to support, say, a fellow Christian in suppressing sexual attraction or sexual orientation. This could be criminal by the law. You know, as Christians, we believe it's a good, moral, and ethical thing to suppress or constrain immoral sexual desires. Reserve it for marriage. We often teach this. But what business does the government have in impinging on our fundamental beliefs and our freedom to teach others this way? We're not forcing anyone to comply. They are free to do as they wish. But if people want prayer, if they want counsel to deal with a specific sexual orientation or sexual attraction that they have, then we should be free to offer it to them. And it won't be long before laws such as these roll out across the nation, with the Tasmanian Law Reform Commission already recommending similar laws. Many of you would be aware of the Australian Law Reform Commission inquiry, which places Christian schools at risk by proposing to remove virtually all exemptions that allow schools to operate according to their Christian ethos. You know, this is either a direct attack on religious freedom, which we believe on some level it is, but for many, I think it is pure ignorance of what the Christian ethos is and how deeply held the convictions of Christians are on these matters. We will not compromise. And we sincerely hope that any religious discrimination laws don't go as far as what's been proposed in the inquiry. But we've already seen these kind of laws enacted in other parts of our nation or threatening to be enacted. In the Northern Territory, amendments to the Anti-Discrimination Act have already removed protections for Christian schools. In WA, the government has broadly accepted recommendations by the WA Law Reform Commission to remove protections for Christian schools and also the right of churches to employ Christian staff. And in Victoria, this has already been enacted. We saw the attack on faith on an extreme level when Calvary Hospital underwent a forced takeover by the ACT government in the name of efficiency. Calvary was a good hospital. You know, it had a history of beating other Canberra facilities in crucial healthcare metrics. And the bill that was introduced to force the takeover, to make it legal, was rushed through Parliament at breakneck speed without the usual public consultation and with an acquisition date set only 5 weeks after the legislation was passed. The government even moved a motion to circumvent the normal committee inquiry process. And we know that this takeover was ideologically driven, because in April 2023, only 3 months before the hostile takeover, the ACT Legislative Assembly Committee report on abortion suggested, which was actually later amended by Corrigendum, that Calvary's overriding religious ethos was problematic and that the ACT government should address this. We are grateful for our freedoms, and we are certainly not persecuted to the extent that Christians in other nations are, who are killed because of their faith. There were 6,000 Christians that were recorded to have been killed as a direct result of their faith in 2022. But there's 360 million Christians that are currently being persecuted worldwide in unimaginable ways. Our inability to post online or threats to Christian schooling, our inability to pray and counsel people is a first world problem. However, how many degrees do we need to shift before the undermining of truth on a seemingly minor level leads to greater injustice, greater persecution, greater limiting of our freedoms, and ultimately societal breakdown? Who would have thought that in Australia we would be leaving babies to die after failed abortions with no medical care? Who would have thought that in Australia teens would be encouraged and affirmed to block puberty and prepare for castration. Who would have thought, or who would think, that we could become a society that persecutes Christians, or other faiths for that matter, for simply adhering to their fundamental beliefs on gender and life? The Chinese government bans books which may contradict government-endorsed theology because they are communist. The Australian government is planning to block online posts that may contradict government-endorsed ideology because they are not acting democratically. Yeah. So we need to wind this all the way back and start again. I would like to start at the babies who are aborted. But we don't have time, because the moment that we are silenced, it's going to make it all the more difficult to change things. So we must start where we are at, which is the battle for our freedom. We must protect our freedom. And we need to put all of our energies into this fight together. When we protect our freedom, we must also protect our children in the womb and in the schools, where they are vulnerable to harmful ideologies that cause them to question their identity and question their biology. And we do this not because it is my right to speak what I believe is right. We don't come from a position of arrogance or a position of pride just because we think we know better. We speak because we are motivated by compassion. Compassion for the vulnerable, compassion for children, and a love for this beautiful nation of Australia and a desire to protect its future. We speak because we're motivated by compassion. And Christians and many others are motivated by the words of Christ. Truly I tell you, whatever you did for the least of my brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Thank you.
Amen to that, Michelle.